Okay, welcome everyone. So 10,000 years ago, the Great Lakes was a very different place than it is today. In fact, they weren't really Great Lakes, they were more like great puddles. So 10,000 years ago, it was very different. It was much colder, it was much drier. The landscape was rebounding really, really fast after having kilometers of ice sitting on top of it for centuries. So all of a sudden, this land is rising really, really quickly. And what it did was it cut out outlets to the Great Lakes, and all the water dropped really drastically, in some cases 100 meters lower than it is today. So what does this mean? Well, it meant that there was all this landscape for people to start hanging out on. Problem? Well, there might be people hanging out on it, but now it's under several tens of meters of water. So how do we actually find these potential archaeological sites that are now underwater? One way we do that is we look for the very tiniest of lithic flakes. So this is the stuff that when somebody makes a stone tool, it's stone tool dust. It gets everywhere. It gets in your hair, it gets in your hands, it gets on your feet. You trample it all over the place. It's less than 1 millimeter in diameter. So what this means is that for every one tool that is produced, millions of flakes are also produced. So it makes a much larger footprint. So our chances of actually finding this material is much larger than actually just one stone tool that might get passed around from person to person to site to site. Now, the tricky part is determining the difference between microdebitage, human-made material, and stuff that's just been kind of ground up and thrown up, glacial puke, as I like to call it, just stuff that's been thrown out by glaciers as they're crunching their way along. How do we tell the difference? Well, we put this stuff under scanning electron microscope, and we look at the flakes. We look at two things. We look at sphericity, and we look at angularity. We look to see if it's rounded, and we look to see if it's flat. If it's angular and flat, it's more likely to be human-produced. Except that sometimes, that's not always the way, that's not good enough. So we put it under SEM, and guess what? These little flakes, these millimeter-sized flakes, often look exactly like the big flakes. They look like they're baby flakes. They're baby flakes, just as look exactly like their parent flakes. So we take sediment samples from these underwater sites, and we look at these little tiny flakes, and sometimes they can tell us that people were actually there, even when we don't have bigger materials to see. And that's how we find archaeological sites in the Great Lakes. Thank you.
But you did a really nice job. Really nice scene setting when you started talking about the Great Lakes, 10,000 years ago, and I thought you did a nice job setting up, what your talk was about. You may have wanted to have a bit of more context of where you were going with that up front. I also thought you had a really nice body language. You were very comfortable using your hands. You may want to watch a little bit with pacing back and forth. Yeah, you did a little bit of dancing. And when you went backwards, you lost the light a little bit. So just remain aware of where you're at on the stage. And if you're blinded by the light, that means you're in the light. And if you, once you, start being able to see the audience a little better, then you're probably lost your light. So, but overall, really, a nice job. And I thought you, did a nice weaving of your story.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Really interesting. Maybe slow down just a little bit, because you have such a nice style in terms of the images that you use, the verbal images, especially glacial puke. I thought was
evocative.
Pretty provocative. Yeah, that's a good word, provocative. Do also kind of watch your eye contact. You might want to think about focusing on somebody here, because when you look at your tape, which I hope you will, you'll see that you're kind of looking off over here, and I looked to see who you were looking at, but the phone isn't really very interested in what you have to say, but they really are. So try to keep that connection going when you can.
Yeah, I agree. I think you have a fabulous stage presence. You're very commanding up there. You're friendly and definitely engaging. I felt you jumped into it a little too quickly. This topic, archaeology, no matter how sexy we make it, it's still a little bit, stones and bones. I was thinking you could have started that with, who's ever been to the Great Lakes? You know, bring the audience into something very familiar and then hit them with, did you know 10,000 years ago? Just one simple line brings the whole audience in. I agree with Cheryl. I think you could have done more up front to say, where are you going? You know, to even just say, in the next 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you why ... Then get into it, right? Because otherwise, it's, I mean, especially because you have such a great stage presence, it's very commanding, it's very like, I'm in charge, which is fabulous, but it can be almost overwhelming for the audience, right? It's like a little too much sometimes. I agree, I love the puke. I love the, you talk about gets in your hair, gets in your clothes. That's great. It brings the audience to the field with you, right? You could have thrown in like it gets between your teeth. I mean, you know, make it funny, you know, but that's great. Bringing them to it. Wandering is something that we all do on stage. The lighting is important. You actually just kept shifting to the right. And I'll say this to all of you, I have a feeling you're all going to do it because we're all sitting on the right, so you're subconsciously going to do that. The problem is it looks like you're about to hit that or fall off the stage. Yeah, exactly. We should all just shift. If you find yourself doing that, the best thing to do is just wander back the other direction. You know, just try to check yourself to make sure, if you are going to wander a little bit to engage with the audience, just make sure you're engaging with everyone, right? So tonight that will be less of a problem, I think. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Great job.